Good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Hoogs, and I have the pleasure of being the Executive Director of Seattle Arts and Lectures. Welcome to the opening night of the 38th season of our Literary Arts series and an evening with Arundhati Roy. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that in Seattle, we stand on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Duwamish, Suquamish, Stillaguamish, and Muckleshoot people. We recognize the stewardship of this land where we now live and work, and the disruption of their care by colonization. We are committed to supporting and building relationships with Native communities through real action and learning about and featuring the work of Indigenous writers and thinkers. To learn more about our work in this area and our commitment to diversity, equity, and belonging, please visit lectures.org/about. I'd like to thank the many partners who have made this evening possible. Thanks to our season presenting sponsor, the Seattle Times. Thank you to our Literary Arts Series sponsor, Delta. Thank you to our media partners, Cascade PBS, KNKX, The International Examiner, and The Stranger. Thank you to our bookseller, Elliott Bay Book Company. Special thanks for major support of our public programs goes to Amazon, the Amazon Literary Partnership, Arts Fund, the City of Seattle, Office of Arts and Culture, Constance Wealth Advisors and NAC Collective, the Echo Fund, the Edgewater Hotel, For Culture, Microsoft, Pivotal Ventures, and the Washington State Arts Commission. Thank you to Bear Winery, Guardian Cellars, and Patagonia for providing beverages for our reception. And thank you to tonight's community partners, Pongo Poetry Project and Tasphere. I'd like to thank our board, our volunteers, our writers and residents, and our staff who work so hard to make all of our programs possible. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining us both in person and online. Could we have a round of applause for this amazing community? The format for this evening will be a conversation, bookended by 2 brief readings. We are delighted to have Shahina Pirali here tonight to lead the conversation. Shahina is a literary arts leader and a book reviewer for Shelf Awareness. She will weave your questions into the conversation, so please feel free to submit a question for the Q&A or vote your favorite questions to the top by going to slido.com and entering the code SAL Roy. After the event, there will be a book signing in the West Lobby. If you didn't bring your book, we have book plates that you can get signed there at the table. We always begin our events with a reading by a writer from our youth programs. This year, we will work with more than 6,000 public school students at 37 public schools and at Seattle Children's Hospital. Tonight's poet is Surjana Kaur from our Youth Poetry Fellowship Program. Please join me in welcoming Surjana Kaur.
Hi, my name's Surjana, and I'm going to be reading my poem, I Don't Know How to Sing Anymore. It's chilly in the mornings here, even in the middle of summer. When Nani Mama is here, she begins making her cha at 6 a.m., wearing her shawl despite the fact that her body echoes with warmth mine doesn't recognize, wind blocked by the same walls that hide sunlight. The kettles don't whistle. I don't draw the voice out of my body, offer it instead to ghosts still standing at the doorstep, weaving in and out of spring. Nani Mama cutting fruits in the kitchen for a breakfast I won't eat. She makes me cha the same way she makes her own. I grow out of the body I have loved and been loved in, renounce every inch of the skin I never fully claimed as my own. The sky withering close to gray, darkening over the doorstep, blurring into rain, my irreverent and irreversible becoming, made new by the thawing of late March, almost as if this house doesn't recognize me anymore. The child I was, unraveling memory, unspooling it with careful fingers. Nani Mama hands me her shawl, tells me how cold I am, almost as if less alive than I once was. No more ghosts living here, only me. Thank you.
Thank you. Seattle Arts and Lectures' mission is to cultivate transformative experiences through story and language for readers and writers of all generations. Part of the transformation is not just about what happens when you listen to an author like Arundhati Roy. It's about what happens when you connect with ideas and with each other. And so with that in mind, we like to start this evening and every evening at SAL by asking you to introduce yourself to somebody nearby that you don't know, and by asking you a question of the evening. And tonight's question is, what song or poem or piece of media do you turn to in times of grief or sadness? We're going to bring the house lights up and take just 2 minutes for this moment of connection. Thank you for indulging us in this. Thank you. Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you so much. I love the roar of you talking to each other. It makes me so happy. Thank you. And now to introduce Arundhati Roy, it is really my delight to welcome Shahina Parali to the stage.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much. And thank you to Seattle Arts and Lectures for hosting us this evening. Thank you also to our very talented and charming poet, youth poet. So Arundhati Roy is no stranger to Seattle. We were one of the very few cities, US cities, she came to in the spring of 1997. She has a great readership here, and Seattle is only one of 4 US cities she is coming to as part of her current book tour. And we are so appreciative. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we find ourselves in a relatively peaceful corner of a world in turmoil. And it's at times like these that many of us turn to literature to make sense of it all, to offer something transcendent and true in a time of numbing upheaval. And it's with that in mind that we gather here today, in the presence of a writer driven by curiosity, not fear, who has deployed her ferocious wit and masterful storytelling to speak truth to power and promote justice-oriented advocacy. The late art critic and novelist John Berger called Arundhati Roy one of the most original and confident thinkers of our time. He famously described her as a direct descendant of the Greek heroine Antigone, for her courageous and principled resistance to state tyranny. Turning to Arundhati's fabulous, astounding memoir, Mother Mary Comes to Me, it is an origin story like no other, a daughter's tribute to a most unusual mother who challenged conventional notions of female success. Its transformative power lies in how it tackles motherhood, grief, and loss, and asks that we allow mothers and daughters the space to be their own people. It spoke to me about viewing the past through a forgiving lens, letting humor in, and extending grace. It also challenged me to reconsider my own definitions of familial love and legacy. Beyond the turbulence of a mother-daughter relationship, it will delight readers with a satirical portrait of a family with a fondness for spectacular feuds. And as we read this book, we realize that it is only someone as formidably brilliant as Mary Roy who could be this writer's mother. So please join me in welcoming Arundhati to the stage.
Thank you, Shahina, and thank you, everybody here. It is a real delight to be here. I've been coming here with large intervals, but since my first novel, The God of Small Things, before I start, I do want to say that this book has been written gazing straight at the live stream genocide in Gaza. And I don't know now, it seems almost ridiculous to be asked to debate it anymore. A genocide that has been intentionally declared, its intent has been declared. I spent the last 3 days with my very beloved friend, Naomi Klein, up in British Columbia, and because both of us are who we are, we had this unspoken pact between us that somehow we needed to not talk, you know? So we were paddle boating out on the Pacific. We looked at the starfish, we looked at shoals of herring, we watched sea lions gorging on salmon. And then as we drove back into the city, and I said this yesterday too, we switched on the news, and it was like we could just see ourselves turn ashen, and a cloudburst of blood just dropped on those sea lions and on the salmon and on the sea and on the starfish and on us, the blood of the people of Gaza, the blood of the children, the blood of the patients in hospitals, the doctors, the journalists, a whole people being exterminated. And the sorrow of it all is that it could end in an afternoon if the powers in this country decided that it wanted it to end. So all of us are somehow being pulled into having to go about our daily lives, loving our children, sending them to school, reading our books, writing our books, while this is going on. And it is a wound through which the whole world bleeds. And I just wanted to say that before starting to write about this, read from this book of mine. As perhaps many of you who are a little older know, Mother Mary Comes to Me is from the lines from a Beatles song called Let It Be. And it's dedicated to my brother, LKC, and it said, "Together we made it to the shore." And it's also dedicated to Mary Roy, my mother, who never said, "Let it be." So the first chapter, I keep wanting to read different parts of the book, but I always end up reading the first chapter because somehow it doesn't require me to explain things, it sets it up for an audience. So the first chapter is called Gangster. She chose September, that most excellent month, to make her move. The monsoon had receded, leaving Kerala gleaming like an emerald strip between the mountains and the sea. As the plane banked to land and the earth rose to greet us, I couldn't believe that topography could cause such palpable physical pain. I had never known that beloved landscape, never imagined it, never evoked it, without her being part of it. I couldn't think of those hills and trees, the green rivers, the shrinking, cemented over rice fields with giant billboards rising out of them, advertising awful wedding saris and even worse jewelry, without thinking of her. She was woven through it all, taller in my mind than any billboard, more perilous than any river in spate, more relentless than the rain, more present than the sea itself. How could this have happened? How? She checked out with no advance notice, typically unpredictable. The church didn't want her. She didn't want the church. There was savage history there, nothing to do with God. So given her standing in our town, and given our town, we had to fashion a fitting funeral for her. The local papers reported her passing on their front pages. Most national papers reported it too. The internet lit up with an outpouring of love from generations of students who had studied in the school she founded, whose lives she had transformed, and from others who knew of the legendary legal battle she had waged and won for equal inheritance rights for Christian women in Kerala. The deluge of obituaries made it even more crucial that we do the right thing and send her off the way she deserved. But what was that right thing? Fortunately, on the day she died, the school was closed and the children had gone home. The campus was ours. It was a huge relief. Perhaps she had planned that too. Conversations about her death and its consequences for us, especially me, had begun when I was 3 years old. She was 30 then, debilitated by asthma, dead broke. Her only asset was a bachelor's degree in education, and she had just walked out on her husband, my father, I should say, although somehow that comes out sounding strange. She was almost 89 when she died, so we had 60 years to discuss her imminent death and her latest will and testament, which, given her preoccupation with inheritance and wills, she rewrote almost every other week. The number of false alarms, close shaves, and great escapes that she racked up would have given Houdini pause for thought. They lulled us into a sort of catastrophe complacency. I truly believed she would outlive me. When she didn't, I was wrecked, heart smashed. I'm puzzled and more than a little ashamed by the intensity of my response. My brother put his finger sharply on that nerve. I don't understand your reaction. She treated nobody as badly as she treated you. He could be right, although according to me, it was he who held that trophy. I can understand him feeling that I was humiliating myself by not acknowledging what had happened to us as children. But I had put that behind me a long time ago. I have seen and written about such sorrow, such systemic deprivation, such unmitigated wickedness, such diverse iterations of hell, that I can only count myself among the most fortunate. I have thought of my own life as a footnote to the things that really matter, never tragic, often hilarious. Or perhaps this is the lie I tell myself. Maybe I pitched my tent where the wind blows strongest, hoping it would blow my heart clean out of my body. Perhaps what I'm about to write is a betrayal of my younger self by the person I have become. If so, it's no small sin, but I'm in no position to be the judge of that. I left home, stopped going home, or what passed as home after I turned 18. I had just entered my third year at the School of Architecture in Delhi. In those days, we finished high school at 16. That's how old I was in the summer of 1976, when I first arrived at Nizamuddin Station alone, without even a working knowledge of Hindi, to take the entrance exam for the School of Architecture. I was terrified and had a knife in my bag. Delhi was 3 days and 2 nights away by train from Cochin, which is a 3-hour drive from our town, Kottayam, which in turn is a few miles away from our village, Aimanam, where I spent my early childhood. In other words, for me, Delhi was a different country altogether. Different language, different food, different climate, different everything. The scale of the city was beyond my comprehension. I came from a place where everybody knew where everyone lived. Pathetically, I asked an auto rickshaw driver if he could take me to the home of my mother's older sister, Mrs. Joseph. I assumed he knew where she lived. He took a deep drag of his beedi and turned away, looking bored. 2 years later, I was the one smoking beedis and cultivating that peerless look of bored disdain. In time, I traded in my knife for a good supply of hashish and some big city attitude. I had emigrated. I left my mother not because I didn't love her, but to be able to continue to love her. Staying would have made that impossible. Once I left, I didn't see or speak to her for years. She never looked for me. She never asked me why I left. There was no need for that. We both knew. We settled on a lie, a good one. I crafted it. She loved me enough to let me go. That's what I said at the front of my first novel, The God of Small Things, which I dedicated to her. She quoted it often as though it were God's truth. My brother jokes that it's the only piece of real fiction in the book. To the end of her days, she never asked me how I managed during those 7 years when I was a runaway. She never asked where I lived, how I completed my course of study and took my degree. I never told her. I managed well enough. After our brittle, tentative reunion, I returned to her, visiting her regularly over the years as an independent adult, a qualified architect, a production designer, a writer, but most of all as a woman watching another with love and admiration and a fair amount of disquiet, not just for her great qualities, but the opposite too. In that conservative, stifling little South Indian town, where in those days women were only allowed the option of cloying virtue or its affectation, my mother conducted herself with the edginess of a gangster. I watched her unleash all of herself, her genius, her eccentricity, her radical kindness, her militant courage, her ruthlessness, her generosity, her cruelty, her bullying, her head for business, and her wild, unpredictable temper, with complete abandon on our tiny, insular Syrian Christian society, which, because of its education and relative wealth, was sequestered from the swirling violence and debilitating poverty in the rest of the country. I watched her make space for the whole of herself, for all herselves in that little world. It was nothing short of a miracle, a terror, and a wonder to behold. Once I learned to protect myself somewhat from its soul-crushing meanness, I even grew fascinated by her wrath against motherhood itself. Sometimes the barefaced nakedness of it made me laugh. Not the laughing out loud kind of laughter, but the kind that comes upon you when you're alone, when you surgically excise an incident from its circumstances and look at it dispassionately, shorn of context, as though she was someone else's mother and as though it were not I, but someone else who was the object of her wrath. As a child, I loved her irrationally, helplessly, fearfully, completely, as children do. As an adult, I tried to love her coolly, rationally, and from a safe distance. But I often failed, sometimes miserably. I wrote versions of her in my books, but I never wrote her. But she liked those versions, though, and embraced the character of Ammu in The God of Small Things, whom she would refer to as I and me. She wanted to be Ammu because she knew very well that she wasn't. When a mischievous journalist asked her whether she had indeed had a tragic love affair, as Ammu had in the book, she looked him in the eye and said, "Why, aren't I sexy enough?" She was in her 60s by then, a diva of her own making. She could say what she liked. When the book came out, she was worried about what secrets it might reveal. To be safe, she checked herself into hospital. There she read it hurriedly and was greatly relieved that it wasn't any kind of exposé. At first she said she couldn't understand what the fuss was all about, and then she studied it closely. After her third or fourth reading, she was home by then, she summoned me to her bedside. It was a bright afternoon, and the light that filtered through her curtains was bordello red. Her eyes were shut. She said that she thought it was a good book, well written. She wanted to know about a particular passage, one in which Ammu's 7-year-old twins, Estepan and Rahel, remembered their parents fighting, how they grew huge like giants and pushed the children from one to the other, saying, "You take them, I don't want them." "Who told you about this? You were too young to remember." "It's fiction." "No, it's not." And she turned to the wall. I have never felt the weight or the sorrow of this memory. I really believed it was fiction. I learned that day that most of us are a living, breathing soup of memory and imagination, and that we may not be the best arbiters of which is which. So read this book as you would a novel. It makes no larger claim. But then there can be no larger claim. Fiction is that strange, smoky thing that writers don't entirely own, even if they think they do. Where does it come from? Our past, our present, our reading, our imagination? Yes. But perhaps from premonitions of our future too? How else can it be that, like the characters in my second novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, I too am now the caretaker of a sort of grave in the grounds of a sort of guest house. It's outlandish. It keeps me awake at night. But then I ask myself, why should we know everything? In my effort to fathom my mother, to see things from her perspective, to accommodate her, to understand what hurt her, what made her do the things she did, and to predict what she may or may not do next, I turned into a maze, a labyrinth of pathways that zigzag underground and surface in strange places, hoping to gain a vantage point for a perspective other than my own. Seeing her through lenses that were not entirely colored by my own experience of her made me value her for the woman she was. It made me a writer, a novelist, because that's what novelists are, labyrinths. And now this labyrinth must make sense of its labyrinthine self without her. To bridge the chasm between the legacy of love she left for those whose life she touched and the thorns she set down for me like little floaters in my bloodstream, fish hooks that still catch on soft tissue as my blood makes its way to and from my heart, is why I write this book. It is as hard to write as it is not to. Perhaps even more than a daughter mourning the passing of her mother, I mourn her as a writer who has lost her most enthralling subject. In these pages, my mother, my gangster, shall live. She was my shelter and my storm. Thank you.
Well, that was phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
First of all, welcome to Seattle.
Thank you.
You've been on a book tour for a few weeks and zigzagging all over Delhi, all through India.
Well, mostly the book, actually, the launch of this book happened in Cochin, in Kerala.
Right.
And the children in my mother's school, from the age of 5 to 15, sang Let It Be. And I had to take everyone away in buckets because they were crying so much. So, yeah.
And your brother also?
My brother sang Let It Be on the stage for the main launch. Yeah.
That's
so
great.
It was all right there.
So how are you feeling?
Began.
How are you feeling? The book has been out in the world and everybody's enjoying it. And how does that make you feel?
Well, you know, it's interesting how you write something and it's so private, and then it's, I suppose, something about an artist, every artist's ego, that it has to go out and it has to be read. But for me, it's something a little more than that, and that is that you know, I live in India and I work in India, and not just me, but so many of us are continuously under threat. And for me, my readers are my protection, you know. So I think that is a beautiful sort of relationship in this increasingly dangerous world between writers and readers, and I respect and love that.
That's wonderful. Oh, you're getting a very warm welcome here. So talking about writing and readers, your mother, Mary Roy, used the technique of free writing when she was teaching you as a young child in school. She also taught you Shakespeare and Kipling, and she knew that you had a writer's heart. So would you mind talking to me a little bit about the idea of the search for language and your need, as you have said, to hunt it down?
Well, my mother, you know, when she left my dad, I mean, she married, as she said, the first person who proposed to her, because she wanted to leave her own father, who was a very cruel person, who called himself he was an imperial entomologist, and I think he was more serious about the imperial part than the entomology part. But, so she married and outside of the Syrian Christian community and went up to Assam, and then you know, where my father worked, and then left and came back down, and eventually, I mean, you can read in the book, but she started a little school. But initially, we lived in this little town called Uti. We broke into my grandfather's house, who was dead by then, and my first, she used to encourage me to write whatever happened during the day or anything, you know. So the first teacher that I had was this very cruel, everyone seems cruel, right? Anyway, this Miss Mitten was her name. She was an Australian missionary, and she ran this little nursery school on the edge of a meadow. And for some reason, she was very hostile to me. The reason was because she gave us sums which were more than 10, and I took off my shoes and socks and counted on my toes, and then she asked me, how did you do it? And I just felt like it was wicked or something to say that I counted my toes. So I said, I did in my head, and she wouldn't believe me, and she every day she'd say, I can see Satan in your eyes. So the first, maybe she was right. Anyway, so the first, I think the first almost coherent sentence that I wrote was, which my mother preserved, was, I hate Miss Mitten, and whenever I see her, I see rags, and I think her knickers are torn. So it's like bad stuff from the beginning. But this free writing thing, you know, I mean, when we moved to Kerala and she started a school, and the one thing, we lived in a little village, there was no shops, there was no cinema, there was nothing, there was just us and the river and the trees and these books that would arrive from the British Council in Madras. And she, at a very young age, you know, there was Shakespeare and all this, as you mentioned. But I think as time passed, as a young person, that's all I ever thought I was going to be, a writer. And yet I knew that the writing was the language was outside me, it was not inside me, you know, and we lived in this multilingual world, and I say somewhere in this book that I knew that this language was the language animal was grazing somewhere, this striped and spotted thing, and I needed to hunt it down like a predator and kill it and drink its inky blood. And it was a very carnivorous and very tactile and palpable desire, you know, and not because I wanted to be a great writer, or it was not an external ambition. It was almost like the only thing that helped me to survive my childhood was somehow finding this language and finding a way to talk to myself, and explain things to myself. You know?
Right. Well, and as you were saying about talking about surviving your childhood, there's a quote that I would like to just say, which was just so beautiful, and the ending of it is particularly poignant, which is, it was almost as though for her to shine her light on her students and give them all she had, we, your brother and you, had to absorb her darkness. Today, though, I am grateful for the gift of darkness. It turned out to be the route to freedom. Could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that darkness and what it felt like to be her children and seeing other children getting all of that light?
So, as I said, my mother started. Sorry? Speak a little louder.
Sure.
Oh no.
Oh, sorry
I'm so
to hear
sorry.
that. Well, I'm going to go ahead and repeat that question. It was a quote, and the quote is, "It was almost as though for her to shine her light on her students and give them all she had, we, your brother and you, had to absorb her darkness. Today, though, I am grateful for that gift of darkness. It turned out to be the route to freedom." I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what that darkness was and how it felt to be the person who had to absorb it and see other students get the best of your mum.
So, is that better? Can you hear me better now? Okay. So, my mother started a little school in the rented premises of the Rotary Club of Kottayam. Every day we would have to go with the brooms and sweep up the men's cigarette stubs and glasses and put out our furniture, and it began with, you know, very few students, and now it's a very lovely, successful school with its own campus. But what happened was that because she had married outside the community and then divorced and come back to this little town, and she had no money, so she was humiliated in a million ways, you know, and she used to convey that humiliation to us, or she used to download it onto us. She would tell us that, you know, people call you in Malayalam address illata pillare, which means the children without an address, because there was, you know, no home as such. And then the school, she rented this little house, and it became a little boarding school where children stayed. So our home was the school, and my brother and I had to call her Mrs. Roy, because she didn't want other children to feel that, you know, we had a special relationship. But firstly she had this rage against men because of her own brother, her father, her husband, and she sort of took that anger against men out on this little boy who was my brother, and that was very hard to watch. It was physically violent, and it was abusive in many ways in terms of what she would say to him. And with me it was a different thing, but it's like you know of so many people. I could see it like a chemical experiment, what was going on with her, and then how that turned into anger against us. I don't want to excuse it as only that, because of course she also inherited some traits from her own father, I think. But the thing is that you know, sometimes or quite often you know about people who are brilliant or gifted or geniuses, whether they are musicians or poets or writers or politicians or whatever, who do not have the same kind of space for their children as, I guess, ordinary, you know, I don't know if there's any such thing as ordinary, but well, a lot of people. But in my case, the problem was that my mother's calling was other people's children. So that was a little confusing for us, you know, and it was, I mean, it was really hard on my brother, because in her school she worked so hard in that little town to make sure that she changed the pH balance between girls and boys. You know, having a co-ed school in a little town was hard enough, and then she really gave the girls the gift of strength and steel and passion, and even, you know, physical exercise and all of that. So for me, not as her daughter, but as a woman, there was some redemption in the battles she fought. But for my brother, that was not so, you know. So I think in writing this book, one of the things that was important for me was to realize that, you know, even if you've grown up in the same space, you have to allow for people to have different feelings about the same experiences sometimes, because it's so complicated, you know, the gifts and the darkness and the light that we are all subjected to.
Yeah. And talking about the men in your mother's life, your uncle, G. Isaac, who was one of the most colorful characters as Chaco in The God of Small Things. And here too, you see him as somebody who, there's been difficulties, there was some difficult past, but yet you've gained so much good from your relationship with him. And would you mind talking a little bit about how, you said he taught you to make friends with defeat?
Yeah, I was joking with Naomi last night, because I did the event with her, and I said, you know, my training in the ideas of success and failure make me look at things so differently, and she and I perhaps are considered to be, you know, successful writers, but actually we are such failures, because every battle we fight, we go down, you know. But that doesn't mean that we are wrong, and that doesn't mean that we stop smiling or keep doing what we do. But G. Isaac was my mother's older brother. He was a Rhodes Scholar who came back to Kottayam, this little town, to start a pickle factory. I mean, actually, that's not even true. His mother had a pickle factory, which he joined. And then he was a Marxist, so he decided to organize his labor against himself, the management. But initially, I used to be very scared of him, because when she first left my father and came to live in this little town called Ooty, which is not in Kerala, in her father's little cottage, G. Isaac and my grandmother came to turn us out of the house, to say that as a woman you do not have any right to your father's property. That was the Travancore Christian Succession Act. And that's how my mother nurtured this rage against that law. And eventually, when she had a footing and the ability to do it, she challenged it. But he had this, and so he was somebody who, I think I might have been 6 or 7 years old, and he showed me some bauble, and he said, do you want this? And I said yes. He said, I'll give it to you if you fail. So it really made me think about all these things, you know, about failure and success. And when he you know, when she won the case, it was won against him because they were the two people fighting over that property, and he was literally, he lost everything. He was turned out of his house. He had to, you know, sell that property, and it had to be divided or whatever. And I mean, I was with a filmmaker who had come from Delhi to make a film about this whole Christian succession law and my mother's victory in the case. And I was in the pickle factory with him when the journalist came out. I mean, when the journalist wanted to interview him, and he set up a shot, and he said, so Mr. Isaac, as a leader of the Syrian Christian community, what are your views on the Syrian Christian, the Travancore Christian inheritance law? And Isaac looked at him and said, well, you know, Mr. Talib, the Syrian Christians are a very diverse community. We have the Syrian Catholics, we have the Yakoba, we have the Marthoma, we have the Pentecost. We have separate churches, we don't agree with each other about anything. But if you question them closely, you'll find there is one thing they agree about, and that is that Isaac is not a leader of the community. So he was just, and there was my father too, who was addicted to alcohol, and you know, who I first met I only met him for the first time when I was 25, and there were all these sort of charming, defeated men around me, and I found them so much more interesting than people who strut around and puff their chests out and are, you know, successful and eat up all the oxygen. So, yeah, I have very good Navy SEAL level training in defeat.
So, adjacent to that subject, we've talked about charming men who haven't been very successful, but it seems that every few years there are about 4 or 5 male lawyers who file a case against you. It sort of happens regularly.
Those are not charming men.
No, but you manage it in a very charming fashion, and we'd love to hear, you know, your thoughts on this subject and how tiresome it must be every few years to get the same attention.
So the first time it happened was when I wrote The God of Small Things, and these 5 lawyers got together and filed a criminal case against me for obscenity and corrupting public morality. And it was meant to, I mean, it was a criminal case, so I was meant to, you know, appear in the court in this little town, and it was supposed to be a ritual of humiliation, and they didn't submit the book, they just submitted the last chapter. And so it had a lot to do with this anger against me and my mother, and you know, these women, they need to be taught a lesson and all of that, plus to do with a great anger because the last chapter of the book was about basically about the lovemaking between Ammu and Velita, who was a Dalit, you know. So there was a fury about this idea of even among the left at that time, a complete incomprehension about how dare you do this, you know. So I asked my lawyer, but can't we just file a technical caveat and say that, well, you know, shouldn't it have been for further corrupting public morality? Because was it pure until I came along, you know? And so he was just like, whatever. And while this case was happening, I won the Booker Prize, and then there was this desire now that I had to, you know, there was the thing about, like, we have to claim her, but then there's this case, and we were all in court, the complainants and me, and the judge came out, and he's like, every time this case comes before me, I get chest pains. It was left. Then the second time it happened, well, I had written this I had written an essay on the Narmada dams, and initially I was, there was a debate among the judges whether I should be charged with contempt of court for disrespecting the court, because one of the things I said in the essay was that I was talking about the Supreme Court judgment allowing this dam to continue and displacing these hundreds of thousands of people who belong to indigenous tribes who did not live in the money economy, and so the promise of land for land, even that doesn't mean anything. But I said to give an indigenous person cash compensation, it's like paying a Supreme Court judge his salary in fertilizer bags. So they got upset and they had a big sort of thing about it, and then they let me off with a warning. But then a little while later, 5 men got together and said that at the protest outside the gates of the court, at which I was not present, that I had tried to kill them with my dupatta. and like even the police knew this is so stupid. And I was summoned by the court, and I basically said, like, don't you have anything better to do? And I didn't have a lawyer, I just wrote my own thing, and then they got really angry. So they said, you're going to have to apologize for this. And I said no. So then I was tried for contempt of court, and it had a 6-month, the jail sentence was 6 months. But as the hearing went on and I didn't apologize, initially they were throwing this essay of mine from one brother judge to another, saying they would refer to me as that woman, that woman, she thinks that we don't understand English. And so I started calling myself the hooker that won the booker. and then when it came to the fact that I was not going to apologize, they said, but you are not behaving like a reasonable man. And then I was, of course, I was sent to jail, but only for a day, and that was my punishment. But then after a few years, again 5 lawyers filed the case. This one was really actually not funny at all, because I had essentially, there was and is ongoing a huge struggle in the forests of central India, where indigenous people's lands, as the old story, given away to mining companies and so on. And there's a conflict raging there, and it was basically the government has flooded the forest with paramilitary and with vigilante groups, burning villages, really raping and killing and trying to clear the land. And the response came from the Maoist party, but 99% of them, of the fighters, are indigenous people, 50% are women. And I went in there and wrote about it. After spending some weeks inside the forest, I wrote a piece called Walking with the Comrades, and then a lot of us sort of campaigned against this operation. It was called Operation Green Hunt. And one of the people who campaigned with me was a friend of mine called G.N. Sai Baba, and he was basically paralyzed from his waist downwards because he had polio when he was a child. And they arrested him and said he was a Maoist, threw him into jail. I wrote a piece called Professor P.O.W., and again 5 lawyers filed this case against me now. And there was a sentence which said that Sai Baba's house was raided by a police party who had a warrant signed by a magistrate in Aheri, a small town in Maharashtra. Oh, she's calling the judge a small town man. So that was the case. I mean, it didn't get resolved, but Sai Baba was put into prison for 10 years, and then he was acquitted very recently. While I was writing this book, he was acquitted, and they said that he shouldn't have been in prison for a day, but he came out and died in 6 months because for a body like that to survive in prison for 10 years. You have no resistance and no resilience, Yeah.
That brings me to one of your most profound quotes. And this is what you've said. You've said, "There is no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately suppressed or the preferably unheard." And could I ask you a little bit about the context for that quote? And
well, see, we're drifting to the last parts of this memoir now, but it's about how basically after The God of Small Things came out, really just months after that, this right-wing Hindu nationalist government came to power and did the nuclear tests, and I at the time was on the front pages or the covers of magazines as this sort of national heroine who had won this big prize, and sort of got rolled into the parade of national pride and nuclear bombs and blah, blah, blah. So I realized quickly that, it was as political to speak out as to stay silent. I would be associated with this forever. So I wrote my first political essay, which was called The End of Imagination, and talking about what nuclear weapons does to your imagination, not just what it does if you use them, but what does it do to the kind of public culture you have. And after that, I wrote a series of, immediately I was kicked off the literary princess, pedestal, and it was like, go to Pakistan and whatever, all these insults. And somehow that made me more at ease, because, who wants to be praised by fascists? So, and then, it was almost like because of that, there was this natural path that opened up, which I walked down. It became about the displacement and dams and the privatization, the opening of markets, and of course going to prison, and all of this. These were not issues for me. These were just part of how a writer lives in the world, in her life, and how are these battles ours. At the same time, people just kept wanting to think of these as separate subjects, and as if I was representing somebody, and I said, I don't represent anybody but myself. And, there is this idiotic, absolutely repulsive quote that, the voice of the voiceless. It really makes me sick, and that's, I think, when I said there is no such thing as the voiceless,
Right.
There's only the deliberately suppressed or the preferably unheard. But I am not representing anyone. To me, these are my battles too, because this is the world I live in, and I'm in the swim of things. I'm not a writer who sort of picks a subject and researches it and does field work. I'm there, I'm in jail, I'm here, I'm there, and one thing leads to another, and these are a way of looking at the world. For me, maybe my land is not going down under the reservoir of the dam, but my worldview is going down.
Yes. Yeah. So you're doing all of these remarkable things, and during that time, your mom, what was your mother thinking and saying, and how were you communicating? How did she feel about you having to go to jail for a day?
Well, my mother, There's a passage in this book where I said that she taught me how to write, and then she raged against the author I became, and she taught me to be free, then she raged against my freedom. So she had a very spiky relationship, not with what I was writing about, but who I was becoming, like once she called me and said, I went to buy some fruit and that woman asked me, are you Arundhati Roy's mother? And I felt as though she had slapped me. She said, so I was like, oh, that's lovely, So it was just this constant, there was this constant, I had to develop these strategies in my mind to survive her, because when I was a child, she would be, oh, I wish I'd dumped you in an orphanage the day you were born. And she told me many times how she had, tried to abort me. So I was like, I'm here now, it's just too bad, but whatever. So I had to develop a kind of armor against her, even though I loved her. It was just like you had to manage her. In some ways, I think I was her mother, like that. But she was, she was a person who fought so many battles in that town that when it came to mine, she didn't have a leg to stand on to tell me to back down or anything. There was none of that. She was worried, but she never sort of asked me to, step back, because I don't think that either she or I had it in us, So sometimes when I'm under fire, I just look at people and say, do you know whose daughter I am? It's not moving my needle,
So you say you have a double doctorate in not reacting.
Yeah.
And is that something that you still are able to do, or you saved that just for your mum?
No, I think it helped me a lot because she had asthma, and she would just be like, if you said anything to her, I'm going to have asthma and go to hospital and die, and it's your fault. So I never, actually, this book is my conversation with her. There was no possibility of any conversation, Yeah. She had weaponized and deployed that very well. So I did learn to not react, and then I think I've just become that person, who wants to think it through, and it served me well, because nowadays it's so terrifying. I mean, I love this audience, but I know that it's being live streamed, and nowadays we never speak in one place, Who's taking notes? Somewhere in New Delhi, I don't know about what I'm saying,
Yeah. Well, so about your mom's asthma, you say that her ill health was her way of controlling people. But as a child, you say you've tried to be her lung, her valiant organ child. And it describes how many of us, when faced with a parent's fragility, especially when we're children, would do anything to take away that frailty. So when did you stop feeling that way? Were you very young when you stopped feeling that you were responsible for keeping her alive?
So it wasn't, these asthma attacks are very dramatic and very terrible, and obviously I'm sure a lot of the reason that she was so bad-tempered was also because the treatment used to be steroids, and we know what that does. But she used to tell me when I was, 5, 6, 7, 8, that I'm going to die. I can die any minute. And what are you going to do? Where are you going to live? Who's going to take you in? You'll be on the streets. So I had this thing about I'll breathe for you. Like I was literally her, external lung. And I think I think I described here like I was her valiant organ child. Like I'll breathe for you, And then when I started to become an adolescent, there was a lot of, her anger against me became very impossible for me to to manage. So I knew that I had to find a way of escaping. Like that was who I was. I always had my eyes on the escape routes, you know, like how am I going to get out of this situation? And it took a lot of plotting and planning, but of course it's all described how I then met this wonderful architect who was building her new campus. And I decided that I wanted to study architecture, not only because it fascinated me, but because I realized that I could start working immediately, like working in architects' offices or doing stuff. I needed to earn my living so that I could get away. I went to Delhi, and as soon as I entered the campus, the very scabby, broken down, polluted campus of the School of Architecture, I just wanted to kiss the filthy parking lot and say, I think I'm free. You know, because I knew then that I needed to only breathe for myself. And that, she sensed that immediately, you know, that I was not now. I grew up thinking if she dies, I'll have to die. I have to find a way of dying. And suddenly I was like, oh, maybe I don't have to die, you know. And that, of course, exacerbated her anger in many ways. It was a pretty deadly dance on a mind.
Well, here we are, 3 years hence, and how do you feel? What do you miss most about her?
Well, I think just the fact that she's just such a unique person. Like, I've just never ever encountered anything remotely like her anywhere, you know. And to be able to know someone who you've known obviously from the moment you were born, who can still continue to surprise you at every minute, is an extraordinary thing, you know. So I miss that, like her absolute uniqueness.
Yeah.
That's why I wrote this book, because I wanted to share her with people. You know, I wanted as a writer, for me, the challenge was, can I write her? You know, this unwritable person, because can I present her to a reader in a way where you too cannot ever make up your mind about her, you know?
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you. I was thinking it's time for us to go to some audience questions here. And here's something from Christian. Did writing Mother Mary Comes to Me shift your relationship with the painful memories of your mother? If so, how did that shift manifest in your daily life?
No, it hasn't changed anything. You know, I mean, it was the kind of relationship which was so present, and I had to negotiate it every second of my life. So there was no surprises about her when, you know, it was not that I discovered her while writing the book. I had to negotiate her all my life, you know. The only surprise was the intensity of my grief, because, you know, it's not that she was young or I was young, but I was so sad, and I was ashamed of how sad I was. Yeah. And I couldn't understand that level of being disoriented, you know.
Yeah.
But it's because you know, somebody who's literally like you. If I had disengaged with her, then maybe it would have been different. But I chose never to. I never wanted to, you know, do that. So then I had to really. A lot of my energy went in managing that relationship.
Right. And Catherine asks, how different, challenging, rewarding was it for you to write about your mother as herself instead of your mother as a fictional character?
Well, the thing is, it would have been pointless to write her as a fictional character because I wanted her to have a place in literature and in history as her, you know. So I didn't want to hide or put any layers between that. And I also think that she would have been unbelievable as a fictional character. People would have been like, oh, you're overdoing it a bit.
That's brilliant. Oh, gosh. Moving on a little bit to your filmmaking career. Are there any parts, this is Jenny, are there any parts of filmmaking that you miss?
Not really. You know, I worked on two feature films. I mean, I wrote 2 feature films. I worked on 3. And I realized that I was a solo artist, you know, like I'm not very good at negotiating things with actors and producers and money and all the rest of it. Because I think because fundamentally to me language, my search for language and my embrace of language, I'm not talking about mother tongue and Malayalam and Hindi, and just the language of a writer is the only way I can stay sane. You know, so for me, that is everything. Yeah.
So we'll shift a little bit. There's so many questions here, just many coming through. And this is a little bit about the lawyers we were talking about earlier. Have your legal struggles changed your relationship to your work, both writing and other things that you do?
Yes, I'm sure it has, you know, because I think that, you know, there is no, like sometimes people refer to me as fearless, and I'm saying it's unintelligent to be fearless, you know, living in the kind of climate and society I live in India, and now that is gradually creeping upon all of you here. The point is you have to learn to live and write and survive and do things in ways which are not foolish, which are not first draft, which are not, sometimes you wanna address this, but you pretend to be speaking there, you know? So there are ways in which you have to find to live in that society. I think in the US and in Western Europe, there's been, I mean, this cloud is coming only now, but so there's been a sort of bratty belief, you know, like I'll just say what I like, where I like, when I like, I can, you know, just, but that's not how it works there. And if you want to live there, you do have to learn how to negotiate these things and how to work. It doesn't necessarily kill creativity. Sometimes it just makes it smarter or slyer or funnier or whatever it is, you know, but it's something you do have to deal with.
Naturally, yes. So let's see. How do you balance, this is anonymous reader, how do you balance your left-leaning values with the realities of promoting your work in a hyper-capitalist country like the US? That's a good one.
Well, the point is that, you know, all of us have contradictions, and if you're in search of purity, then good luck to you, you know.
Yeah.
The point is that in this book, there's a lot about money, because I actually, obviously, you know, lived a early life in which I had none. And then when I wrote The God of Small Things, I felt like I had bust open the pipeline that takes the money of the world's wealthy to the world's wealthy, and sort of it was just spewing money at me. And it troubled me a lot, to have money, to be a writer in this society which has such deprivation and such poverty, and what do you do with it, So actually what I do with it, and there is a description of that in this book, is that a group of us have a trust, and the money that my books make, a lot of it goes into that trust, and then it goes towards helping other people do work which challenges the status quo. People make films, people have news portals. It's just amazing. There are activists who I've written a lot about capitalism and about this NGO culture and how it's a pretend tiger, so what we call paltu sher in Hindi, a tiger on a leash, pretending to do work but de-radicalizing things, So here is money, a writer's money, a writer's royalty, and that goes to people who don't know how to use this well-oiled machine and make these proposals. There are people in rural areas, activists, all kinds of people are supported by the royalties that come from my work.
That's fabulous. So this is a wonderful question because it's a topic that we haven't really touched upon, but it's a big part of your literary career. And that question comes from Siamun, and it is, where does Kashmir go from here? And you've talked about Kashmir in your writing. You'll be reading from an excerpt about the end of Imagination, but we hadn't really talked about Kashmir at all. So where does Kashmir go from here?
Well, I don't know. I'll say this, that people don't know much about what happens in India. India used to be a friend of Palestine. Today, India is a friend of Israel. And if people protest about what's happening in Gaza, in India, it is not the police that stop that protest, but other people, Hindu nationalists. And again here, there is, and I have written a lot about Kashmir, and it is one of the most dangerous subjects for me to be ad-lib speaking about. So I urge you to read what I write, and I stand by what I write always. But it is a very dire situation because there is no freedom of speech at all in that place. None. Not from journalists, not on Facebook, not on Twitter, not on social media. As you know, we know now today social media and internet has been shut down in Gaza, but India's been doing that for so long. When it changed the special status of Kashmir for 3 months, it shut down the internet. So now, after that, the situation is extremely, I'd say, depressing, and the fact that all the noise in India also cuts out the truth about Kashmir. It's not that there's silence about Kashmir, there's noise, and there's propaganda, and there's lies, and there's almost nobody who can say anything.
Right, yeah. So one of my most favorite characters of yours is Anjum from The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, and that book is remarkable conversation between two graveyards, one in Kashmir and one in Delhi, and it's incredibly impactful. But I think we have time for one more question, and I was thinking we'd keep it like a simple question, something easy before we have another reading. So this question comes from Atib, and he asks, do books need to be read with dog ears and torn pages, or do you promote the use of a bookmark? And he says he's asking for his wife.
Why isn't she asking?
Yes.
Where is your wife? But no, honestly, I love the sight of dog-eared, bookmarked, underlined books. And I love the sight of dog-eared, bookmarked, unbotoxed human beings too.
Oh gosh, it's been such a pleasure. I have so many questions, so many topics.
I'll just move here.
But before we do the final reading,
Okay.
I just want to touch on one subject, because I know there's so many people here who are mothers, who are daughters here today, and it's so meaningful how you've talked about mothers and daughters having space to be their own people. And I know that that's something that we all struggle with as mothers and daughters. And I know in the past you haven't wanted to give advice. You say that you don't often give advice, but what could you share with people here today, young women or their mums? Just one little nugget of wisdom that they can take away from this evening.
Well, it's not wisdom, but an observation. I think that while we do know that there are, there's a constant refrain in this book which says the safest place is the most dangerous. Yes. And I know that, a family doesn't have to be a safe space, and there's terrible trauma and sometimes trauma that cannot be resolved without, professional help, without therapy and so on. Yet I do feel that that's now become a generic thing, and all of us are allowing ourselves to be flattened by this sort of therapy speak, and we are inhabiting someone else's language and someone else's description. And nowadays, I don't know about here, but in India, what I find so frightening is young people are using AI as therapy, and it's constantly, what you say, it's constantly justifying you to yourself. And, it just leaves no room for taking responsibility or for imperfect people who are part of your life, you know. So I feel I have felt that, in places like India and Pakistan and in the East, we have, of course, this mother worshipping that goes on, but the mother has to produce sons, and then the mother has to behave in certain ways in order to be worshipped. She has to behave herself. And then you have the mother demonizing that goes on here, almost as a backdoor entry into taking down feminism, So I just think that sometimes we have to describe ourselves to ourselves. We have to search for that language and understand that everyone's, this kind of broad spectrum therapy doesn't always work. I don't know, maybe I'm overstepping, but.
Yeah. No, thank you.
It's just like, I think it's just a plea for space for imperfection between us,
I love that. Thank you. And now we have the good fortune of hearing you read from your essay, The End of the Imagination.
I just read a paragraph from this and then.
All right, sounds good.
So this is just a small, so basically after Mrs. Roy passed away, we really didn't know what to do because, the church, there was no place for her in the church and she didn't want to be buried anyway. And the Kottayam, Kerala can be very sophisticated in some ways, and so they have a mobile gas-fired crematorium. So we brought it in, and then we scattered some of her ashes in the river, but then I decided that instead of making her a grave, I would make her a grove, planted with all the things she loved, and with this little slab slanting into a trough of water where there were fish and frogs and lilies, and on that slab it said, dreamer, warrior, teacher. And without even discussing it, my brother and I decided the mother part we'd leave out, because those were not the stripes that she fought for. But she certainly was a dreamer and a warrior. So I'm just going to read you a paragraph of my first night in a Mrs. Roy-less world. I spun unanchored in space with no coordinates. I had constructed myself around her. I had grown into the peculiar shape that I am to accommodate her. I had never wanted to defeat her, never wanted to win. I had always wanted her to go out like a queen. And now that she had, I didn't make sense to myself anymore. A friend in Delhi who hadn't ever met her sent me a couplet in Urdu that comforted me more than anything anyone said. It allowed me to see her happy, liberated from a body that had limited her so severely. I saw her walking through her campus once more, breathing easily, bending to smell the flowers, looking up to count the jackfruits and coconuts, inspecting every corner of it in a way she hadn't done in years. Aaj ki raat मैं घूमूंगा खुली सड़कों पर, आज की रात मुझे ख्वाबों से फुर्सत कुछ है. That means, tonight I will wander on open roads. Tonight I have some time off, even from my dreams. So, now I'll read to you a little passage about dreams and about what's obviously some recurring theme with me, failure and success and so on. But this was from my first political essay called The End of Imagination, written in 1998 after the nuclear tests. And as I said, it was about what happens to your imagination when you become a nuclear power. And I had sensed the public language in India had changed ugly, and I could sort of see what was coming from then, and of course it has come now, and now we've even stopped being surprised, and that's the danger we face. We've normalized the ghoulishness of it all. Anyway, I told my friend there was no such thing as a perfect story. I said, this is just an excerpt where I'm having a conversation with a friend of mine. I said, in any case, hers was an external view of things, this assumption that the trajectory of a person's happiness, or let's say fulfillment, had peaked and now must trough because she had accidentally stumbled upon success. It was premised on the unimaginative belief that wealth and fame were the mandatory stuff of everybody's dreams. You've lived too long in New York, I told her. There are other worlds, other kinds of dreams, dreams in which failure is feasible, honorable, sometimes even worth striving for, worlds in which recognition is not the only barometer of brilliance or human worth. There are plenty of warriors whom I know and love, people far more valuable than myself, who go to war each day knowing in advance that they will fail. True, they are less successful in the most vulgar sense of the word, but by no means less fulfilled. The only dream worth having, I told her, is to dream that you will live while you're alive and die only when you're dead. Which means exactly what? She asked. I tried to explain, but didn't do a very good job of it. Sometimes I need to write, to think, so I wrote it down for her on a paper napkin, and this is what I wrote. To love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power, above all to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget. Thank you.